Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights and turning our gaze to the sky, to the wind, to the rain, and yes, even to the blazing sun, to explore how people dealt with awful weather before technology and more. You might complain about a surprise rain shower ruining your outdoor plans, or a heat wave making your air conditioning work overtime. But imagine a time when a simple summer storm could devastate your entire livelihood, when a harsh winter meant a very real threat of starvation, or when a dry spell could turn your fertile land into a dusty, barren wasteland. We're going back to a time when weather wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a force of nature that dictated every aspect of daily life, shaping destinies and inspiring both awe and terror. You'd probably trade places with someone stuck in a modern-day blizzard, even without power, rather than face a single day of what our ancestors endured. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? What time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the terrifying realities of living at the mercy of the elements. Our first deep dive takes us to the very beginning, to ancient storm survival. Imagine yourself as an early human, perhaps in a small community nestled in the valleys of what would one day become the sprawling plains of Oklahoma, or along the rugged coastlines of what we now call Oregon, thousands of years ago. You're not checking a weather app. Your only forecast comes from the changing wind, the darkening sky, and generations of accumulated wisdom passed down through whispered stories. A distant rumble of thunder isn't just a sign to grab an umbrella, it's a prelude to a terrifying, existential threat that could shatter your world. The most disturbing fact about ancient storm survival was the utter helplessness in the face of nature's raw power. Without advanced meteorology, reliable shelters, or organized emergency services, early humans were completely at the mercy of the elements. A violent thunderstorm wasn't just a light show, it brought torrential rain that could flood rivers and wash away entire settlements, fierce winds that could uproot massive trees and tear apart flimsy dwellings, and lightning that could ignite devastating wildfires. Imagine living in a world where the very sky could literally fall on your head, where the air itself could become a weapon, and where there was no concept of a safe place beyond the most basic, often inadequate natural shelters. It's like being perpetually camping, but the weather forecast is always cataclysmic. Their primary defense against these terrifying storms was simple: immediate shelter. Caves offered some protection, but were not always available or safe from flooding. Overhanging rock formations, dense forests, or quickly constructed, temporary lean-tos made from branches and animal hides were the best they had. These were not designed for comfort or long-term living, but for momentary survival. Imagine huddling together with your family in a small, cramped cave, listening to the deafening roar of the wind and rain outside, feeling the ground tremble with distant thunder, knowing that your entire existence hinges on the durability of a rock face or the strength of a few tied branches, a common historical fact. Many indigenous tribes across North America, long before European arrival, developed sophisticated understandings of local weather patterns and adapted their dwelling structures accordingly. For example, some Pueblo peoples in the Southwest built multi-story adobe structures that offered excellent protection from both extreme heat and violent desert storms, while Plains tribes relied on easily dismantled and rebuilt teepees that could withstand strong winds by swaying with them. This demonstrates early humans' ingenious adaptations, but also highlights that even with adaptation, they remained vulnerable to unprecedented events. Imagine a society where every architectural choice is a survival strategy against the wrath of the sky. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about ancient storm survival involves the desperate measures taken to protect their vital resources. For early agricultural communities, a severe hailstorm or flash flood could wipe out an entire season's crops in minutes, leading to immediate famine. For hunter-gatherers, A prolonged storm could scatter game or make hunting impossible, leading to starvation. Imagine not just worrying about your home, but watching the very source of your next meal being violently destroyed by the elements. With no food banks or government aid to fall back on, this forced them into desperate attempts to salvage what they could, often putting their lives at further risk, demonstrating the profound interconnectedness of weather, food, and survival. It's like knowing that if the hail falls for 10 minutes, your entire family starves next winter. The psychological toll of living under such constant, unpredictable threat was immense. The world was a place of powerful, often vengeful, natural forces. This fostered a deep sense of reverence, but also profound fear, leading to elaborate rituals, sacrifices, and myths designed to appease storm gods or spirits. Imagine a community huddled together, chanting or praying, believing that their very survival depended on the whims of an angry deity. This wasn't just superstition, it was a coping mechanism for an existential dread that permeated every aspect of their lives. The aftermath of a major storm was often just as terrifying. Fallen trees blocked paths. Water sources could be contaminated, and the landscape itself could be utterly transformed, making familiar hunting grounds unrecognizable or traditional migratory routes impassable. Imagine emerging from shelter to a world that looks completely alien, with devastation as far as the eye can see, and the daunting task of rebuilding your shattered existence with only rudimentary tools. This constant cycle of destruction and rebuilding shaped their societies and their understanding of their place in the natural world. The reliance on oral traditions and generational knowledge was critical but imperfect. Young members of the tribe would learn from elders about historical floods, legendary droughts, and the signs of impending doom. This collective memory was their only form of long-term weather forecasting. But it could be catastrophically wrong when faced with unprecedented events, or when the knowledge was lost due to disease or conflict. Imagine your entire survival guide being whispered stories, vulnerable to misremembering or incomplete transmission. This highlights the fragility of their knowledge base compared to modern meteorological science. The misery wasn't just the physical danger, it was the constant, gnawing anxiety of unpredictability. Modern life offers us the illusion of control, the ability to plan around weather. For ancient humans, there was no such illusion. Every sunny day was a gift. Every cloud on the horizon a potential harbinger of disaster. This cultivated a profound humility towards nature, but also a pervasive sense of vulnerability, where their very existence felt like a tiny, fragile spark in a vast, indifferent universe. The academic debate about the precise impact of climate shifts on ancient civilizations often grapples with the interplay of environmental factors versus human societal development. Some historians argue that while localized extreme weather events were certainly devastating, larger but long-term shifts in climate like mini ice ages or prolonged droughts were far more significant drivers of societal collapse or migration for ancient peoples, suggesting that while individual storms were terrifying, they were often just symptoms of larger, more systemic environmental pressures that truly tested human adaptability. They contend that the misery was often a cumulative effect. The misery, in this view, was a slow burn crisis. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immediate, catastrophic impact of sudden extreme weather events. Flash floods, superstorms, prolonged heat waves on local communities, arguing that these rapid, unpredictable disasters could wipe out entire settlements, agricultural systems, and trade routes, causing immense acute misery and forcing sudden, desperate migrations that fundamentally reshaped human societies regardless of long-term climate trends. They suggest that the shock of an immediate awful storm could be just as, if not more, devastating than a creeping environmental change. It's a debate that makes you ponder the sheer power of the weather and how deeply it has always shaped the human story, forcing us to adapt or perish. As the quiet echoes of ancient thunder and the distant whispers of desperate prayers from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle hum of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why ancient storm survival was often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just passing inconveniences. They were fundamental challenges that brought real fear, profound devastation, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's raw power. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of immediate, catastrophic weather events. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern weather forecasting. Sturdy homes and organized emergency services, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient storms. As the quiet echoes of ancient thunder and the distant whispers of desperate prayers from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle hum of your room to reassert its calm, we now journey into another terrifying extreme of weather, confronting brutal winter's embrace. Forget your cozy heated blankets, your insulated homes, and the convenience of ordering groceries online during a snowstorm. For our ancestors, the arrival of winter wasn't just a seasonal change. It was a grim, annual battle for survival against freezing temperatures, relentless blizzards, and the looming specter of starvation, turning months of cold into a prolonged test of endurance. Imagine yourself as a settler in the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of the early American frontier. Perhaps in a small log cabin in the newly established territories of Ohio, or the snow-laden peaks of the Sierra Nevada in California. Centuries ago, the first flakes of snow aren't a picturesque sight. They're a harbinger of dread. The biting wind whistles through the cracks in your walls, and the ground outside hardens into an impenetrable fortress of ice. Every chore, from chopping wood to fetching water, becomes an arduous, freezing struggle. You might grumble about shoveling your driveway, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether your family will literally freeze to death by morning. The most disturbing fact about brutal winters was the absolute dependence on preparation and meager resources. Survival hinged on meticulous planning during the warmer months, gathering enough firewood, preserving enough food, and having adequate, though often insufficient, clothing and shelter. Without modern insulation, central heating, or reliable supply chains, a single mistake or an unexpectedly harsh cold snap could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine painstakingly collecting every scrap of firewood, every dried berry, every cured piece of meat, knowing that if you fall short, your family simply won't make it to spring. It's like living with an impossible to-do list, where failure means the ultimate consequence. The cold itself was a constant, insidious enemy. Frostbite wasn't just a nuisance, it could lead to the loss of limbs or severe tissue damage. Hypothermia could set in rapidly, even indoors in inadequately heated dwellings. Imagine waking up shivering uncontrollably, your breath fogging in the frigid air of your own home, knowing that a deeper chill could numb your senses and slowly claim your life. This wasn't a temporary discomfort, it was a pervasive, bone-aching cold that seeped into everything, making every movement painful and every breath a challenge. A common historical fact. The winter of 1778 at Valley Forge during the American Revolutionary War stands as a stark testament to the brutality of historical winters. Thousands of Continental Army soldiers, lacking adequate food, clothing, and shelter, suffered from frostbite, disease, and exposure. While not civilians, their plight illustrates the widespread misery inflicted by harsh winters before modern logistics and technology, even on organized forces. Imagine trying to fight a war when your biggest enemy is the weather itself. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about surviving brutal winters involves the constant fear of fuel depletion and its desperate solutions. Wood was the primary source of heat for centuries, and running out meant certain death. Communities would often deplete local forests, forcing people to venture further and further into dangerous, snow-covered terrain, risking blizzards, encounters with wild animals, or getting lost, just to gather fuel. Imagine having to make an agonizing choice: stay in your freezing home and die slowly, or brave a deadly snowstorm to find enough wood to survive another day. knowing that the journey itself might kill you. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about the desperate life or death calculus of fuel. It's like playing a game of Russian roulette, but the empty chamber is a lack of firewood. Food scarcity was another terrifying reality. Winter meant dormant crops, frozen rivers, and often scarce game. Stored provisions had to last for months, and rationing was a grim necessity. Imagine looking at your dwindling supplies, knowing that every spoonful of dried beans or every bite of salted meat had to be stretched to its absolute limit, with no guarantee that spring would arrive before starvation set in. This led to widespread malnutrition, weakening populations and making them more susceptible to disease, turning winter into a deadly trap. The blizzards and heavy snowfalls weren't just inconvenient, they could isolate entire communities for weeks or even months. Roads became impassable, communication ceased, and any hope of outside help vanished. Imagine being snowed in, completely cut off from the outside world, your closest neighbors miles away, knowing that if illness struck or a structure failed, you were entirely on your own. This profound isolation added a psychological burden to the physical suffering, fostering a sense of being utterly alone against the elements. Furthermore, the lack of proper medical care during winter amplified the misery. Illnesses, often exacerbated by cold and malnutrition, spread rapidly in cramped, unventilated dwellings. Without antibiotics or sophisticated medical knowledge, common colds could turn into pneumonia, and minor injuries could lead to fatal infections. Imagine shivering with a fever, knowing that the nearest doctor is days away, if accessible at all, and that your only hope lies in rudimentary herbal remedies or desperate prayers. The misery wasn't just the physical cold and hunger, it was the constant, pervasive anxiety of uncertainty. Would the winter be mild or record-breaking? Would the stored food last? Would someone fall ill? This annual dread permeated every aspect of life, turning the colder months into a test of human spirit and resilience, a season of quiet suffering and desperate hope for the return of warmth. The academic debate about the precise impact of historical winters on human societies often grapples with how much was due to the weather itself versus the societal structures. Some historians argue that while harsh winters certainly caused immense suffering and mortality, well-organized communities with strong social bonds and effective traditional knowledge like indigenous peoples' deep understanding of local ecosystems were surprisingly resilient, suggesting that societal preparedness and communal support could mitigate some of the brutality, making human organization as important as the severity of the cold. They contend that it was a test of human ingenuity. The misery in this view was also an opportunity for cooperation. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the overwhelming and inescapable nature of extreme cold and starvation, arguing that for vast numbers of people, especially the poor or those in new settlements, the brutal reality of winter was a relentless and unavoidable killer, leading to widespread suffering, disease, and death regardless of social organization, fundamentally shaping demographics and patterns of settlement through sheer attrition. They suggest that the brutality was universal and inescapable for most. It's a debate that makes you ponder the sheer raw power of cold, and how much of our modern comfort is built upon the ingenuity that overcame generations of agonizing winter struggles. As the quiet hum of freezing winds and the distant echoes of desperate attempts to stay warm from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why brutal winters were often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just chilly seasons, they were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound hunger, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's relentless cold. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of freezing, starving, or succumbing to illness. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern heating. Abundant food and reliable emergency services, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of brutal winters. As the quiet hum of freezing winds and the distant echoes of desperate attempts to stay warm from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle, we now shift our focus to the opposite extreme, confronting scorching summer's cruelty. Forget your air conditioning, your ice-cold drinks, and the luxury of seeking shade at a moment's notice. For our ancestors, relentless heat waves and pervasive drought weren't just uncomfortable. They were a profound threat to life, health, and livelihood, turning the summer months into a grueling test of survival against an invisible, suffocating enemy. Imagine yourself as a farmer in the vast, sun-baked fields of what would one day become Kansas or the arid desert landscapes of Arizona. Centuries ago, the sun beats down relentlessly, day after scorching day, baking the earth into a cracked, dusty expanse. Your well begins to run dry, your crops wither, and the very air feels like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The chirping of crickets isn't a peaceful sound, it's a maddening reminder of the relentless heat. You might complain about a broken air conditioner, but at least you can drive to a store for a cold drink. For them, every drop of water was a fight for survival. The most disturbing fact about scorching summers was the constant, debilitating threat of dehydration and heat stroke. Without understanding fluid balance or having access to abundant, clean water, people easily succumb to the heat. Working in fields or traveling long distances under the relentless sun could quickly lead to collapse and death. Imagine trying to perform strenuous labor tending crops, herding animals, or building structures under a sun that felt like a forge, feeling your strength drain away with every bead of sweat, knowing that if you didn't find water soon, your body would simply give up. It's like running a marathon every day, but the finish line is just survival, and there are no water stations. Water scarcity was the ultimate terror. Rivers dwindled, wells dried up, and springs became mere trickles. Communities became locked in desperate struggles for access to dwindling water sources, leading to conflict and widespread suffering. Imagine walking for miles under the blistering sun, carrying empty buckets, only to find the community well nearly empty, or worse, guarded by desperate strangers. The sheer effort required to simply find enough water to drink, let alone for hygiene or agriculture, dominated their lives during these periods. This wasn't about conserving water, it was about the desperate, minute-by-minute hunt for existence, a common historical fact. The Dust Bowl era in the American Midwest in the 1930s, though a more recent historical event with some technology, provides a powerful illustration of prolonged drought's devastating impact. Years of severe drought, coupled with poor farming practices, turned fertile land into barren dust, forcing mass migrations and causing immense suffering. While our focus is pre-technology, the Dust Bowl perfectly demonstrates the catastrophic societal consequences of a long, hot, dry spell, forcing people to leave their homes and livelihoods in search of survival. Imagine your entire world turning into a gritty, suffocating cloud. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about coping with scorching summers involves the desperate measures to protect precious livestock and crops. For farming communities, their animals were their lifeblood, and their crops their future. During prolonged droughts, families would sometimes face agonizing choices: sacrifice a beloved animal to save another, use their dwindling water supply to try and save a few plants, or simply watch their entire livelihood wither and die. Imagine looking into the eyes of your starving livestock, knowing you have no water to give them, or watching your fields turn to dust, powerless to stop the slow, agonizing death of your only source of food. This deep sense of helplessness against the elements was a profound source of misery. It's like watching your bank account drain to zero, but your bank account is literally your survival. The impact on sanitation and hygiene was also severe. With limited water, practices like bathing, washing clothes, and properly disposing of waste became impossible. This led to a surge in waterborne diseases when people were forced to drink contaminated sources. and skin infections due to poor hygiene. Imagine the smell, the flies, the constant itching, and the lurking fear of illness, all compounded by the inability to clean yourself or your surroundings. This made already miserable conditions even more dangerous. Furthermore, the threat of wildfires soared during dry, hot periods. A single lightning strike or a careless spark could ignite vast expanses of forest or dry grassland, rapidly spreading and consuming homes, fields, and lives. Imagine living with the constant smell of smoke on the horizon, knowing that a wall of fire could sweep through your community at any moment, leaving nothing but ash in its wake. This added another layer of terrifying unpredictability to the already brutal summer months. The psychological toll of such unrelenting heat and thirst was immense. It fostered a pervasive sense of exhaustion, irritability, and despair. Hope could wither as quickly as the crops, and the sheer effort of daily survival left little room for joy or optimism. This wasn't just physical discomfort, it was a profound mental and emotional drain. A slow, agonizing grind against an invisible, oppressive force. Their limited solutions were often simple and largely ineffective against prolonged extremes. Seeking shade during the hottest parts of the day, wearing light-colored, loose clothing, and conserving every drop of water were their primary strategies. Building homes with thick adobe walls, as some indigenous peoples did in the American Southwest, offered excellent insulation against both heat and cold. But such sophisticated techniques were not universally available. For many, coping was simply enduring. The misery wasn't just the physical heat, it was the constant, gnawing anxiety of dwindling resources. Every drop of sweat felt like a loss. Every sunny day, another step towards ruin. This cultivated a profound appreciation for water, but also a deep-seated fear of its absence, turning summer into a season of anxious waiting and desperate measures, where life itself hung by a fragile, desiccated thread. The academic debate about the precise causes and impacts of historical heat waves and droughts often grapples with the interplay of natural climatic cycles versus human land management practices. Some historians argue that while natural variations in climate certainly cause severe heat and drought, human practices like deforestation, overgrazing, and unsustainable agriculture often exacerbated these conditions, turning difficult periods into catastrophic ones by degrading the land and reducing its resilience to climatic stress, suggesting that human actions significantly amplified the misery. They contend that the misery was often a self-inflicted wound. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the overwhelming power of natural climatic phenomena, arguing that regardless of human practices, certain historical periods experienced extreme, prolonged heat waves and droughts that would have caused immense suffering and societal disruption, even in the most well-managed communities. Highlighting that even with perfect human stewardship, nature's most brutal extremes could still bring entire civilizations to their knees. They suggest that the cruelty of the sun was a force beyond human control. It's a debate that makes you ponder the terrifying power of the sun and the lack of water, and how much our modern world truly relies on the simple comfort of turning on a tap or an air conditioner. As the quiet hum of scorching winds and the distant echoes of desperate thirst from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why scorching summers were often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just warm seasons, they were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound hunger, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's relentless heat. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of dehydration, starvation, or succumbing to illness. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern air conditioning, abundant clean water, and advanced agricultural techniques, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of scorching summers. As the quiet hum of scorching winds and the distant echoes of desperate thirst from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle, we now face another formidable adversary that shaped human history Floods nature's overwhelming force. Forget your sturdy levees, your sophisticated drainage systems, and the reassuring presence of emergency responders. For our ancestors, rising waters weren't just a threat to property. They were an immediate, overwhelming force that could sweep away entire communities. Drown livestock, destroy crops, and unleash disease, transforming fertile lands into deadly, chaotic torrents. Imagine yourself as a farmer living along the Mississippi River in the 18th century. Perhaps in a small, burgeoning settlement that would one day become a part of Missouri, or a community nestled by the often treacherous Ohio River, centuries before modern flood control. A prolonged period of heavy rain, or a sudden spring thaw in the mountains, causes the river to swell. At first, it's just a rising tide, perhaps a little unsettling. Then, the banks overflow. The water, a dark, churning menace, invades your fields. Then your home, forcing you to scramble for higher ground, leaving everything you own to the mercy of the current. You might fret about a leaky basement, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether your entire house will be swept away by a wall of water. The most disturbing fact about historical floods was the speed and destructive power of the water, coupled with the lack of effective warning systems or defenses. A sudden flash flood could turn a gentle creek into a raging torrent in minutes, catching communities completely off guard. Larger river floods, while slower, brought an unstoppable force that could erode land, flatten structures, and drown everything in its path. Imagine living in a valley, seeing the river slowly rise, but having no way to know if it will crest in hours or days. No way to reinforce your flimsy home, and no higher ground close enough to truly escape the inevitable deluge. It's like watching a slow-motion disaster movie, but you're starring in it, and there's no director to yell, "Cut." Their primary defenses were incredibly rudimentary. People often built homes on slightly elevated ground or tried to construct simple earthen berms, but these were largely ineffective against major floods. Evacuation was often chaotic and last minute, leading to immense loss of life and property. Imagine grabbing what few possessions you can carry, herding your terrified animals, and scrambling through rising water, hoping to reach a distant hillside before the current becomes too strong, knowing that many won't make it. A common historical fact. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, though relatively recent, vividly illustrates the destructive power of uncontrolled river systems. Before extensive levee systems were in place, this flood inundated vast areas across several states, displacing over 1 million people and causing immense economic and human suffering. While technology was beginning to emerge, this event shows the raw, unmitigated power of major river floods even into the 20th century. Imagine the river that defines a nation becoming its greatest enemy. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about floods involves the aftermath of disease and contaminated water sources. Once the floodwaters receded, the misery was far from over. Left behind was a landscape of mud, debris, and most dangerously, contaminated water. Wells would be polluted. Stagnant pools would become breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria. And the lack of sanitation led to outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Imagine surviving the initial deluge, only to face an unseen enemy in the water you desperately need to drink. Watching your community succumb to sickness, unable to stop the spread of disease that the flood had unleashed. This transformed the disaster from a swift, dramatic event into a prolonged period of sickness and death. It's like escaping a fire only to find yourself in a room full of poison gas. The destruction of agricultural land was another devastating consequence. Floodwaters could deposit thick layers of infertile silt, wash away topsoil, or simply submerge crops for too long, ruining an entire season's harvest. For communities dependent on farming for survival, this meant immediate famine. Remember Chapter 2's brutal winter's embrace, and Chapter 3's scorching summer's cruelty, and the reliance on food stores. Imagine watching your fertile fields, your family's entire livelihood, disappear under a brown, churning expanse, knowing that the food you planted for the year is utterly gone, leaving you with nothing but the prospect of starvation. Furthermore, rebuilding homes and communities after a major flood was an incredibly arduous task, often undertaken with minimal resources. Homes would be reduced to rubble, possessions swept away, and infrastructure like rudimentary roads or bridges destroyed. Imagine trying to reconstruct your home from salvaged, waterlogged timbers, without modern tools or building materials, knowing that the next heavy rain could bring the water back all over again. This cycle of destruction and precarious rebuilding fostered a deep sense of impermanence and vulnerability, a constant fear of the inevitable return of the water. The psychological toll of living with the constant threat of floods was immense. It fostered a deep sense of fatalism and helplessness in the face of an unpredictable and overwhelming force. Every heavy rain, every swollen stream, brought with it a renewed wave of anxiety. This wasn't just physical danger, it was the quiet, gnawing dread of knowing that your home, your livelihood, and your very existence could be wiped away at any moment by a force that defied all human efforts to control it. Their coping mechanisms often involved a mix of practical adaptations and spiritual appeasement. People learned to read the signs of the river, to store essentials in high places, and to move quickly when the danger became imminent. But they also turned to deities, performed rituals, and sought omens, believing that only supernatural intervention could protect them from nature's overwhelming wrath. The misery wasn't just the physical devastation, it was the profound sense of insecurity and the cyclical nature of loss. For many communities, floods were not a one-off event but a recurring nightmare, repeatedly washing away their progress, their memories, and their very sense of belonging to a place. This created a generation-spanning burden of anxiety and a life lived perpetually on the edge of disaster. The academic debate about the long-term impact of floods on historical societies often grapples with whether these disasters primarily fostered resilience and adaptation or led to collapse and migration. Some historians argue that while devastating in the short term, recurring floods often forced communities to develop innovative hydraulic engineering, stronger communal bonds, and a deeper understanding of their environment, leading to long-term adaptation and even prosperity in some floodplains, like the ancient civilizations along the Nile or Mesopotamia, suggesting that humans, despite the misery, found ways to live with and even thrive from the rhythms of the water. They contend that it was a harsh teacher. The misery, in this view, was a catalyst for ingenuity. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immense and often irreparable damage caused by major, unpredictable flood events, arguing that for many communities, particularly those without the resources for large-scale engineering, or without the benefit of fertile floodplains, such disasters led to repeated displacement, demographic decline, and ultimately the abandonment of once thriving settlements, highlighting that the overwhelming force of water was often simply too much to overcome, leading to widespread and persistent misery. They suggest that the immediate devastation frequently outweighed any long-term benefits of adaptation. It's a debate that makes you ponder the sheer power of water, and how much of our modern world's stability is built upon the ingenuity that tamed rivers, allowing us to sleep soundly, even when the rain pours down, as the quiet hum of rising waters and the distant echoes of desperate cries for help from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns. You're left with a stark understanding of why floods were often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just wet periods. They were fundamental challenges that brought real fear, profound devastation, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's overwhelming force. Their very existence, but however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of being swept away, drowned, or succumbing to disease. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern flood control, early warning systems, and organized emergency relief, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful sight of ancient floods. As the quiet hum of rising waters and the distant echoes of desperate cries for help from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle, We now confront a particularly insidious and drawn-out form of natural disaster, drought. The silent killer. Forget your perfectly manicured lawns, your endless supply of bottled water, and the diverse grocery store aisles. For our ancestors, a prolonged lack of rain wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a slow, agonizing descent into scarcity, famine, and societal collapse, turning once fertile lands into dust and forcing desperate migrations. Imagine yourself as a member of a farming community in the American Southwest, perhaps in what is now New Mexico or parts of California. Centuries ago, relying solely on the sky for your sustenance. The spring rains, usually reliable, simply don't come. The early summer sun bakes the earth, hardening it like concrete. You watch your young crops shrivel and turn brown, the leaves curling in despair. The local stream, usually bustling with life, becomes a mere trickle, then dries up entirely. You might complain about watering your garden during a dry spell, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether your entire family will starve because the earth itself has turned against you. The most disturbing fact about historical droughts was their insidious, cumulative nature and their devastating impact on food and water supplies. Unlike a sudden flood or a violent storm, drought doesn't strike with immediate drama. It slowly tightens its grip, day by agonizing day, week after week, month after month. The initial effects are subtle: a smaller harvest, a lower water level, but as time wears on, the scarcity becomes absolute. Rivers become dusty beds, wells run dry, and the land, once teeming with life, becomes barren and cracked. Imagine watching your world slowly desiccate, the very air you breathe turning gritty with dust, knowing that every passing day brings you closer to absolute famine with no end in sight. It's like living under a slowly suffocating blanket, where every breath becomes harder than the last. The collapse of agriculture was the primary engine of misery. Without rain, crops failed en masse. Grains, vegetables, and fruit trees simply withered and died. Livestock, unable to find pasture or water, starved or became too weak to provide milk, meat, or labor. For societies built on sustenance farming, this meant widespread, inescapable famine. Imagine waking up each day to the sight of dying plants and emaciated animals, knowing that the very foundation of your community's survival is crumbling before your eyes, with no prospect of relief, a common historical fact. The Anasazi people, ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples, in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, experienced severe by prolonged droughts that significantly impacted their advanced agricultural societies between the 11th and 13th centuries. These environmental pressures are believed to have contributed to the eventual abandonment of many of their large, intricate settlements, demonstrating how even sophisticated cultures could be forced to relocate or drastically alter their way of life by long-term water scarcity. Imagine an entire civilization packing up and leaving their ancestral lands because the rain simply stopped coming. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about drought's impact involves the desperate search for food in barren landscapes. As stored provisions dwindled, people would resort to eating anything they could find: roots, bark, insects, even dirt in some extreme cases, leading to severe malnutrition and often death from food poisoning or organ failure. Imagine the utter humiliation and desperation of having to forage for wild weeds or boil leather for sustenance, simply to quiet the gnawing pain of hunger, knowing that what you are consuming offers little to no nutrition. This wasn't just about hunger. It was about the complete breakdown of dignity and the raw, animalistic struggle to survive, where every moral boundary might be tested. It's like being forced to eat the inedible, just to feel something in your stomach. The rise in disease was another devastating consequence of drought. With limited water for hygiene, sanitation plummeted. Contaminated water sources, when available, led to outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses. Weakened by starvation, people were far more susceptible to disease, turning drought into a dual threat of hunger and sickness. Imagine struggling with debilitating stomach cramps or a high fever, unable to properly clean yourself or access clean water, knowing that the very thing you need to survive is also the thing that might kill you. Furthermore, drought often led to mass migrations and societal upheaval. As resources vanished, communities would be forced to abandon their ancestral lands in desperate search of water and fertile ground. These migrations were arduous, dangerous journeys, often leading to conflict with existing populations in the areas they sought to enter. Imagine being forced to leave everything you know: your home, your farm, your community's history, and walk for weeks or months into the unknown, carrying your emaciated children, hoping to find a place where the rain still falls, knowing that every step brings you closer to exhaustion or a hostile encounter. The psychological toll of living through a prolonged drought was immense. It fostered a deep sense of despair, fatalism, and a pervasive, gnawing fear for the future. The slow, relentless nature of the disaster meant that hope would slowly erode, replaced by a quiet desperation. This wasn't just physical suffering, it was a profound spiritual and emotional drain. A sense of betrayal by the very earth that once sustained them. Their coping mechanisms were often tragically limited. Water conservation. Every drop was precious. People learned to collect dew, dig deep for groundwater, and find every possible hidden spring. Rain dances and rituals. In many cultures, desperate prayers and elaborate ceremonies were performed to appease rain gods or spirits, a testament to their helplessness. Rationing. Strict rationing of food and water was implemented, often with painful fairness, but rarely enough to prevent suffering. Migration. When all else failed, the only option was to move, often to equally parched or hostile lands. The misery wasn't just the physical thirst and hunger, it was the slow, agonizing death of hope and the fragmentation of communities. Drought didn't just kill people, it broke societies, forcing desperate choices and turning neighbors into competitors for the last remaining resources. This created a lasting legacy of fear and a profound respect for the simple miracle of rain. The academic debate about the primary drivers of societal collapse in ancient civilizations often grapples with the interplay of environmental factors versus internal societal weaknesses. Some historians argue that while internal conflicts, political instability, or poor leadership certainly played a role, severe and prolonged droughts were often the ultimate tipping point for many ancient societies, pushing them beyond their adaptive capacity and leading to widespread famine, disease, and forced migration, suggesting that even a strong society could be brought to its knees by an overwhelming environmental catastrophe. They contend that the misery was an inescapable force. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the resilience and adaptive strategies of many ancient communities in the face of climatic shifts, arguing that societal collapse often occurred not just because of drought, but when existing social inequalities, resource mismanagement, or external conflicts prevented communities from effectively implementing coping mechanisms or adapting to changing conditions, suggesting that the silent killer often preyed on already vulnerable or poorly managed societies, amplifying existing miseries rather than creating them out of whole cloth. They suggest that human choices often determined whether the drought was merely difficult or truly catastrophic. It's a debate that makes you ponder the terrifying power of a dry spell, and how much of our modern world's stability depends on the simple fact that our faucets turn on and our grocery shelves remain stocked. As the quiet hum of parched winds and the distant echoes of desperate pleas for rain from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why drought was often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just dry spells, they were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound hunger, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's relentless thirst. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of starvation, disease, or forced displacement. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern irrigation, robust food systems, and advanced water treatment, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of ancient droughts. As the quiet hum of parched winds and the distant echoes of desperate pleas for rain from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle, we now brace ourselves against an unseen, yet incredibly powerful, adversary wind. The unseen fury, yet forget your reinforced windows, your hurricane-rated doors, and the comfort of a sturdy, modern foundation. For our ancestors, violent winds weren't just a blustery day, they were an invisible, destructive force that could rip apart homes, devastate landscapes, and hurl dangerous debris, turning a calm day into a terrifying struggle for survival. Imagine yourself living in a small coastal community in the Carolinas in the 17th century. Or perhaps a pioneer family building a new life on the open plains of Nebraska in the 19th century, where the wind seems to stretch endlessly to the horizon. The day might start calm, but then the air begins to shift. A low moan turns into a howl, and suddenly, the very world around you feels like it's being torn apart. Trees bend violently. Loose objects become deadly projectiles, and your flimsy dwelling creaks and groans under the unseen assault, threatening to collapse at any moment. You might complain about a strong gust blowing off your hat, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether your entire house will be ripped to shreds, or if you'll be hit by flying debris. The most disturbing fact about historical windstorms was their unpredictable nature and overwhelming destructive power, especially against vulnerable structures. Before advanced meteorology, the sudden onset of a powerful gale, a derecho, or a hurricane, could leave communities with no warning. Their homes, often built from wood, sod, or mud, were simply no match for sustained, high-speed winds. Imagine standing inside your humble home, hearing the terrifying roar of the wind outside, feeling the walls tremble, and seeing dust and debris force through every crack, knowing that the very roof over your head could be ripped away at any second, exposing you to the full fury of the storm. It's like living inside a drum, and someone is beating it with a giant, invisible hammer. Their primary defense was often simply trying to find the most protected spot, or desperately holding their structures together. For those in more permanent settlements, homes might be built low to the ground or clustered together for mutual protection. For those on the open plains, sod houses provided some insulation and wind resistance, but even they could be damaged by extreme events. Imagine clinging to a sturdy piece of furniture inside your home, listening to the agonizing splintering of wood as the storm tries to tear it apart, knowing that your only hope is the structural integrity of a few hand-hewn logs, a common historical fact. The Galveston hurricane of 1900, though occurring at the cusp of modern technology, remains America's deadliest natural disaster, killing an estimated 6,000 to 12,000 people. This catastrophic event, fueled by massive storm surge and powerful winds, demonstrates how utterly vulnerable even well-established coastal cities were to tropical cyclones before sophisticated warning systems, building codes, and rapid evacuation capabilities. Imagine a city being wiped off the map, primarily by the force of wind and water, with virtually no warning. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about surviving powerful winds involves the desperate, last-minute attempts to secure property, often with fatal consequences. When an intense windstorm approached, people would frantically try to secure shutters, tie down wagons, or even brace walls with their own bodies, often staying outside far too long. Imagine the terrifying moment when you realize the wind is strong enough to lift objects you thought immovable, and you're faced with the agonizing choice: risk your life trying to save your livelihood, or abandon everything and run, knowing that abandoning your farm or home could mean starvation later. This led to countless injuries and deaths from flying debris, falling trees, or collapsing structures, as people made valiant but often futile attempts to protect what little they had. It's like playing a game of chicken with a freight train, but the freight train is invisible and made of pure force. The destruction of forests and natural barriers was another devastating consequence. Forests, which often provided a natural buffer against strong winds, could be flattened by powerful storms, leaving communities even more exposed to future events. This also meant the loss of vital resources like timber, game, and foraging areas. Imagine a familiar landscape suddenly stripped bare, trees uprooted and shattered like matchsticks. Realizing that the very protection nature once offered has been violently ripped away, leaving you exposed and vulnerable. Furthermore, that the impact on agriculture was immense. High winds could flatten entire fields of crops, especially tall grains like corn, just before harvest, leading to widespread food shortages, a recurring nightmare we've seen in previous chapters. Orchards could be stripped of fruit, and barns, often flimsy structures, could be demolished, killing livestock and destroying stored feed. Imagine watching your entire year's labor, your family's entire sustenance, being flattened and scattered across the horizon in a matter of minutes, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. The psychological toll of living with the constant threat of destructive winds was immense. It fostered a deep sense of powerlessness and a lingering anxiety about the sky. Every sudden gust, every distant rumble, brought with it a renewed wave of fear. This wasn't just physical danger, it was the quiet, gnawing dread of knowing that an invisible force could appear at any moment and tear apart everything you had worked so hard to build. Leaving you completely exposed and vulnerable? Their limited solutions primarily involved structural adaptations and seeking the lowest, most protected ground. Homes in wind-prone areas might be built with stronger, more tightly joined timbers, or constructed underground for added stability. People learned to find shelter in ditches, culverts, or behind natural barriers during tornadic events. But these were often desperate measures against overwhelming forces. The misery wasn't just the immediate physical threat, it was the profound sense of impermanence and the constant fear of sudden, unexpected ruin. For many communities, powerful winds were not a rare occurrence, but a recurring nightmare, repeatedly testing their resilience and reminding them of their fragility. This created a legacy of anxiety and a deep respect for the power of the unseen air around them. The academic debate about the long-term societal impact of historical windstorms often grapples with whether these events primarily fostered community resilience and adaptive building practices, or led to widespread displacement and societal breakdown. Some historians argue that while acutely destructive, localized windstorms often spurred communities to innovate in building techniques, develop stronger communal support networks for rebuilding, and learn to respect and adapt to their local weather patterns, suggesting that humans often found ways to recover and even thrive in wind-prone regions by developing a collective memory and proactive strategies for mitigation. They contend that it was a harsh but effective teacher. The misery, in this view, could lead to unexpected strength. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the immense and often irreparable damage caused by major, unpredictable wind events, especially large-scale hurricanes or powerful tornadoes, arguing that for many communities, particularly those with limited resources or in vulnerable geographical locations, such disasters led to repeated loss of life and property, long-term economic devastation, and ultimately forced migrations and the abandonment of once thriving areas, highlighting that the unseen fury was often simply too powerful to overcome, resulting in persistent and widespread misery. They suggest that the sheer destructive force often overwhelmed any capacity for resilience. It's a debate that makes you ponder the terrifying power of the unseen air, and how much of our modern world's stability is built upon the ingenious engineering that allows us to sleep soundly, even when the strongest gales howl outside. As the quiet hum of howling winds and the distant echoes of splintering wood from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why wind was often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just blustery days. They were fundamental challenges that brought real fear, profound devastation, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's unseen fury. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of their homes being torn apart, their livelihoods destroyed, or their lives swept away. take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern building codes. Advanced warning systems like radar and organized emergency response, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful sight of ancient winds. As the quiet hum of howling winds and the distant echoes of splintering wood from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle, we now turn our gaze upward, to the sky, to confront a unique and often globally impactful natural phenomenon, volcanic ash and atmospheric haze. Forget your clean air filters, your clear blue skies, and the assurance that your flight won't be grounded by distant events. For our ancestors, volcanic eruptions, even those hundreds or thousands of miles away, weren't just spectacular displays. They could unleash vast clouds of ash and gases that blocked the sun, cooled the planet, ruined crops, and spread disease, turning a seemingly normal day into a prolonged period of eerie twilight and profound suffering. Imagine yourself as a farmer in the fertile valleys of upstate New York in the late 18th century, or a settler on the expansive plains of Iowa in the early 19th century. The sun, usually a comforting golden orb, begins to look strange, muted, perhaps a reddish-orange hue. The air, normally crisp, feels heavy and smells faintly of sulfur. A fine, gritty dust begins to settle on everything, coating your crops, your home, your lungs. You hear whispers of a distant mountain, far to the west. That has erupted. But the true cause and scale of this strange, suffocating phenomenon are beyond your comprehension. You might complain about a hazy day from distant wildfires, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether this strange atmospheric phenomenon will literally cause your entire harvest to fail, or plunge your region into a sunless, starving winter. The most disturbing fact about volcanic ash and atmospheric haze was their widespread, often global impact and their insidious effect on climate and agriculture. Unlike localized storms or floods, a major volcanic eruption could inject massive amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it could spread around the entire planet, reflecting sunlight back into space. This caused a phenomenon known as volcanic winter, leading to prolonged periods of cooler temperatures, disrupted monsoons, and altered rainfall patterns, often thousands of miles from the eruption itself. Imagine waking up day after day to a perpetually dim, yellowish sky, feeling a chill in the air even in summer, knowing that something unseen, somewhere far away, is slowly strangling the very light and warmth that sustains your crops and your life. It's like living under a permanent, dusty cloud, where the world is slowly dimming, and you don't know why. The primary misery inflicted by this atmospheric haze was widespread crop failure and subsequent famine. The reduced sunlight, cooler temperatures, and altered weather patterns caused by the volcanic veil could decimate harvests across continents. For societies utterly dependent on agriculture, this meant widespread starvation. Imagine your fields, which normally thrive in the summer sun, becoming stunted and barren, the seeds simply refusing to sprout, or the plants dying young, all because the light and warmth you depend on are being stolen by an invisible atmospheric shroud. This was a slow, agonizing descent into hunger, affecting vast populations who had no idea of the true cause. A common historical fact. The year without a summer in 1816 was a direct consequence of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. This massive volcanic event caused widespread climate anomalies across the northern hemisphere, leading to significant crop failures, famine, and social unrest in parts of North America, particularly New England, and the mid-Atlantic states in Europe. Farmers in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine reported snow in June and widespread frost in July and August, devastating their harvests. This serves as a stark example of how a single distant volcanic eruption could unleash global misery, causing widespread hunger and desperate conditions thousands of miles away. Imagine surviving a summer where there was no warmth, only cold and hunger, all because of a mountain you'd never heard of on the other side of the world. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about coping with volcanic ash and haze involves the profound psychological impact of the eerie, altered sky. Beyond the physical misery, living under a perpetually dim, strangely colored sun with unusual sunsets and sunrises often led to widespread fear, superstition, and apocalyptic beliefs. People didn't understand the scientific cause, so they attributed the strange phenomena to divine displeasure, curses, or the end of the world. Imagine waking up to a sky that looks perpetually like an unsettling twilight, seeing the sun as a dull, reddish disk, and believing that God or angry spirits are punishing humanity, leaving you with an overwhelming sense of dread and hopelessness. This turned an environmental crisis into a spiritual and existential one, amplifying the misery through fear and misunderstanding. It's like living inside a slowly unfolding horror movie, but it's real, and you're just waiting for the final, terrifying scene. The impact on human health was also significant, though often less understood at the time. Volcanic ash, when inhaled, can cause respiratory problems, exacerbating conditions like asthma and bronchitis. The reduced sunlight could also lead to vitamin D deficiencies, impacting bone health and immune systems over time. Imagine breathing in a fine, gritty dust that irritates your lungs, causing persistent coughing and wheezing, knowing that every breath might be bringing more of this invisible irritant into your body, making you feel perpetually unwell. Furthermore, the disruption to ecosystems could be devastating. Reduced sunlight and altered temperatures affected natural vegetation, impacting grazing animals and wild food sources. This had a cascading effect on indigenous communities and settlers who relied on hunting, foraging, and fishing, further compounding the food scarcity caused by agricultural failures. Imagine going to your usual hunting grounds or fishing spots, only to find the animals scarce and the plants withered, realizing that the very environment you depend on for survival is silently dying, piece by piece. The misery wasn't just the physical effects, it was the overwhelming sense of powerlessness and existential dread. People understood local weather, but a global atmospheric change caused by a distant volcano was incomprehensible. This fostered a profound helplessness, a sense that the very fabric of their world was unraveling, and there was nothing they could do but endure the slow, suffocating decline. Their coping mechanisms were often tragically limited and based on superstition rather than science. They might resort to desperate prayers, communal fasting, or sacrifices to appease angry gods. Farmers might try to plant alternative, hardier crops, but often with limited success. The primary solution was simply to endure, to ration, and to hope that the strange, dim period would eventually pass. The misery wasn't just the immediate crop failure, it was the prolonged, eerie period of uncertainty and the widespread, unidentifiable cause of their suffering. For many, it felt like the world was fundamentally changing, a permanent shift towards a darker, colder existence, leaving them with a pervasive sense of hopelessness and a deep fear of the unknown. The academic debate about the long-term societal impacts of major volcanic eruptions often grapples with how much these environmental shocks directly cause societal collapse versus simply exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. Some historians argue that while localized devastation from the eruption itself was immediate, the widespread climate-altering effects of volcanic ash, leading to prolonged agricultural failures and famine across vast regions, were direct and often overwhelming drivers of societal instability, migration, and increased mortality, suggesting that even robust societies could be brought to their knees by these unpredictable global atmospheric changes. They contend that the misery was an inescapable planetary event. Conversely, other scholars emphasize that societies with diverse economies, robust trade networks, or effective food storage and distribution systems were often more resilient to the distant effects of volcanic winters, arguing that, while challenging, the primary devastation often occurred in areas already struggling with resource scarcity, poor governance, or overpopulation, suggesting that while the haze created widespread misery, its ultimate impact was often mediated by existing societal strengths or weaknesses. They suggest that human adaptability and social structures played a crucial role in determining the true extent of the suffering. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense global reach of natural forces and how fragile our existence can be, even when the immediate danger is thousands of miles away. As the quiet hum of eerie ash-laden winds and the distant echoes of desperate prayers for the sun from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why volcanic ash and atmospheric haze were often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just dusty days, they were fundamental challenges that brought real fear, profound hunger, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's subtle, yet globally impactful, wrath. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of starvation, disease, or a world plunged into a dim, chilling twilight. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern meteorology, global communication, and diverse food supplies, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of volcanic haze, as the quiet hum of eerie, ash-laden winds and the distant echoes of desperate prayers for the sun from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle. We now shift our perspective from confronting weather's raw power to humanity's early, often fumbling, attempts to understand and predict it, meteorology's primitive roots. Forget your Doppler radar, your satellite imagery, and your hyper-local forecast delivered instantly to your phone. For our ancestors, predicting the weather wasn't a scientific exercise, it was a desperate art, a mix of folklore, observation, and intuition, where a wrong guess could mean the loss of crops, livelihoods, or even lives, leaving them in a constant state of anxious anticipation. Imagine yourself as a farmer in the vast, rolling farmlands of Pennsylvania in the early 18th century, or a sailor navigating the treacherous waters off the coast of New England. Centuries before the first official weather bureau, you don't have a reliable long-range forecast. Your knowledge comes from observing the behavior of animals, the shape of the clouds, the feel of the wind on your face, and the wisdom passed down through generations. A red sky at night might be a mariner's delight, but a sudden drop in the barometer, if you even had one, would fill you with dread. You might check your phone for tomorrow's forecast, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether your entire year's harvest hinges on your ability to interpret a cloud formation. The most disturbing fact about primitive meteorology was the profound uncertainty and the devastating consequences of inaccurate predictions. People relied on a patchwork of local wisdom, proverbs, and omens. While some observations held a grain of truth like red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky in the morning, sailor's warning, they were often unreliable, localized, and lacked the scientific basis to predict severe events with any certainty. Imagine making crucial decisions like when to plant, when to harvest, or when to embark on a voyage based on fragmented observations and hopeful guesses, knowing that a miscalculation could lead to ruin. It's like playing a high-stakes game of chance. But the dice are the whims of an unpredictable sky. Their primary tools were their senses and generations of accumulated folklore. Farmers watched the movement of birds, the behavior of livestock, the way smoke rose from chimneys, and the patterns of clouds. Sailors studied the tides, the currents, and the subtle shifts in wind direction. These observations, while sometimes insightful for short-term, very localized changes, offered little protection against large-scale, sudden, or prolonged weather events. Imagine straining your eyes against the horizon, trying to discern the true meaning of a distant cloud formation, your entire livelihood depending on your ability to read the sky, with no scientific instruments to aid you, a common historical fact. Many Native American tribes developed intricate knowledge of their local climates and microclimates, far surpassing European settlers' initial understanding. For instance, the Navajo people of the American Southwest possessed detailed knowledge of seasonal wind patterns, rain cycles, and the behavior of local wildlife that served as indicators for various weather phenomena, enabling them to adapt their nomadic and agricultural practices. This sophisticated indigenous knowledge demonstrates an advanced form of primitive meteorology, honed over centuries, that relied on deep ecological observation rather than technology. Imagine a community whose very survival is encoded in the subtle shifts of nature around them. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about primitive meteorology involves the use of animal sacrifice and superstitious rituals to influence or predict weather. When desperate, facing prolonged drought or an impending storm, communities would often resort to elaborate rituals, offerings, or even animal sacrifices, believing they could appease weather deities or compel natural forces to behave as desired. Imagine a community in despair performing a desperate ritual, sacrificing a precious animal, believing that this act, rather than any scientific understanding, would bring the rain they so desperately needed or avert the storm that threatened to destroy them. This wasn't just about belief. It was a testament to their utter helplessness and the lengths to which people would go when faced with an incomprehensible threat. It's like performing an elaborate dance to make your internet work, knowing deep down it's probably futile, but having no other options. The impact of misinterpretation or false hope was profoundly miserable. A misread omen could lead farmers to delay harvest just before a devastating hailstorm, or sailors to set sail directly into a hurricane. The hope generated by a promising sign, only to be dashed by a sudden turn in the weather, inflicted deep psychological pain and exacerbated the sense of powerlessness. Imagine thinking you've outsmarted nature, only for the sky to unleash its fury, proving your predictions tragically wrong, and leaving you to face the ruin of your efforts. Furthermore, the lack of communication and widespread information sharing meant that knowledge remained localized. A community might have excellent traditional weather knowledge for their specific valley, but it wouldn't help a distant town facing an unprecedented event, nor would it allow for regional coordination of resources or warnings. Imagine a severe drought developing across state lines, but with no way for communities to share observations or predict the regional scale of the disaster, leaving each town to suffer in isolation. This exacerbated the vulnerability of decentralized societies. The psychological toll of living under such meteorological uncertainty was immense. It fostered a deep-seated anxiety about the future, a pervasive sense of being at the mercy of unpredictable forces. Every cloud, every gust of wind could be a source of dread. This wasn't just about practical challenges, it was the quiet, gnawing fear of the unknown, the constant battle against a world that often refused to reveal its intentions. Their scientific breakthroughs were often slow, incremental, and deeply intertwined with observation rather than experimentation. The invention of simple barometers and thermometers in the 17th and 18th centuries provided the first truly quantitative tools for understanding atmospheric pressure and temperature. But their use was limited, and the understanding of how these elements interacted was still rudimentary. For centuries, most people relied on folk wisdom, often with disastrous results. The misery wasn't just the lack of accurate data, it was the constant, exhausting effort of trying to read a capricious sky and the crushing burden of responsibility that came with those guesses. Farmers, sailors, and even entire communities lived with the knowledge that their lives, and the lives of those they loved, depended on their ability to interpret subtle, often misleading, signs from nature. This created a legacy of cautiousness, superstition, and a profound respect for the weather's power. The academic debate about the role of folklore and early observation in the development of meteorology often grapples with whether these practices were primarily a form of proto-science or simply superstition. Some historians argue that while lacking formal scientific rigor, the centuries of accumulated local weather lore and the keen observational skills of indigenous peoples and early agriculturalists constituted a vital, empirical body of knowledge that allowed communities to adapt and survive within their specific environments. Suggesting that these primitive roots laid a crucial foundation for later scientific inquiry by identifying patterns and correlations, even if the underlying mechanisms were misunderstood. They contend that it was a practical, if limited, science. The misery, in this view, was also a driving force for careful observation. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the inherent limitations and frequent inaccuracies of such anecdotal and unscientific methods, arguing that despite occasional lucky guesses, the vast majority of primitive meteorology left communities profoundly vulnerable to unpredictable and catastrophic weather events, leading to immense suffering and loss of life because they lack the predictive power and systemic understanding necessary for true mitigation or adaptation. Suggesting that reliance on folklore perpetuated widespread misery rather than alleviating it. They suggest that while charming, these methods were largely insufficient for real protection. It's a debate that makes you ponder the immense chasm between ancestral observation and modern scientific prediction, and how much of our daily comfort is built on our ability to simply check a phone for tomorrow's forecast, as the quiet hum of whispered proverbs and the distant echoes of anxious glances at the sky from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns. You are left with a stark understanding of why meteorology's primitive roots meant such an agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just quirky beliefs, they were fundamental challenges that brought real fear, profound uncertainty, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's unpredictable whims. Their very existence, however simple, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of being caught unaware, of making a fatal decision based on a false omen, or of succumbing to the elements without warning. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of modern weather satellites, supercomputers, and highly accurate forecasts, a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of primitive meteorology, as the quiet hum of whispered proverbs and the distant echoes of anxious glances at the sky from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle. We now broaden our scope to understand how utterly intertwined human existence was with the whims of nature, weather's impact on daily life. Forget your climate-controlled environments, your year-round access to a variety of foods, and the ease of travel regardless of the season. For our ancestors, every single decision, every daily chore, every long-term plan was dictated and profoundly shaped by the elements, turning life into a constant negotiation with an often unforgiving natural world. Imagine yourself as a settler in colonial Virginia in the early 17th century, or a trapper in the vast, untamed wilderness of what would become Montana in the 19th century. Your day doesn't begin with a weather report. It begins with the feel of the air, the look of the sky. Will the ground be too wet to plow? Is the river frozen enough to cross? Will the approaching storm make hunting impossible every step? Every task, every breath you take is a direct response to the weather around you. You might plan your weekend based on the forecast, but at least your biggest worry isn't whether a sudden frost will wipe out your entire year's food supply. The most disturbing fact about weather's impact on daily life was the absolute lack of separation between human activity and meteorological conditions. There was no indoor life as we know it, insulated from the elements. Homes were rudimentary, often leaky, and poorly insulated. Travel was always outdoors, exposed to sun, wind, rain, and snow. Work, whether farming, hunting, fishing, or building, was almost exclusively performed under the open sky. Imagine living a life where the temperature outside literally dictated the temperature inside your home, where your ability to get food depended entirely on the sun and rain cooperating, and where a simple journey could turn deadly if the weather shifted unexpectedly. It's like living in a permanent outdoor adventure, but without any of the convenient gear, food production. The very basis of survival was utterly at the mercy of the weather. Farmers depended on timely rain for planting and growth, enough sun for ripening, and a gentle autumn for harvest. Too much rain meant flooded fields and moldy crops. Too little meant drought and withered plants, remember. Chapter 5's Drought the Silent Killer. An early frost could wipe out an entire season's work in a single night. Imagine the constant anxiety of watching the sky, knowing that a single weather event could lead to starvation for your family and community, turning farming into a high-stakes gamble against nature. A common historical fact. The agricultural calendar of early American farmers was entirely dictated by the seasons and weather patterns. Planting corn in the spring, harvesting hay in the summer, gathering wood in the fall before the first frost, and enduring the lean months of winter were all directly linked to the weather. Communities lived and died by the rhythm of the sun and rain, adapting their entire social and economic lives to fit these natural cycles. Imagine your entire year being mapped out not by a planner, but by the relentless, often brutal march of the seasons. One particularly grim, lesser-known detail about weather's impact involves the pervasive smell of dampness, smoke, and decay in homes and clothing. During prolonged wet or cold spells, without modern heating, ventilation, or drying methods, homes during long rainy periods or cold winters would become perpetually damp, leading to mildew, rot, and a pervasive, lingering stench. Clothes, once wet, would take days to dry, if at all, often developing a damp, musty smell that never truly went away. Imagine living in a constant state of damp chill, your clothes never truly dry, and the air around you thick with the smell of wet earth and lingering wood smoke, knowing that this discomfort is your daily reality for months on end. This wasn't just unpleasant. It contributed to respiratory illnesses and overall malaise, making daily life a sensory ordeal. It's like your house is perpetually a slightly mildewed tent in a damp forest. Travel and communication were also profoundly limited by weather. Roads, if they existed at all, turned into impassable quagmires in heavy rain or deep snow. Rivers, essential arteries for trade and movement, could freeze solid in winter or flood unpredictably in spring. This meant communities were often isolated for months at a time, making trade difficult, news slow to arrive, and emergency help impossible. Imagine needing to reach a doctor in the next town, but a blizzard has made the path impassable, or a swollen river has swept away the only bridge, leaving you entirely cut off and helpless. This isolation deepened the misery of illness and scarcity. The impact on health and hygiene was relentless. Remember Chapter 5's Health's Constant Threat. Extreme heat or cold could directly cause death or illness, but beyond that, prolonged wet weather fostered conditions for disease, while drought led to contaminated water sources. The lack of clean water due to frozen rivers or parched wells made bathing and washing clothes difficult, leading to widespread skin ailments and infections. Imagine trying to stay clean and healthy when the very elements conspire against you, making every basic act of hygiene a difficult, often impossible chore. Furthermore, social gatherings and community life were often dictated by the weather. Festivals, markets, and visits to neighboring communities would often be postponed or canceled due to adverse conditions, impacting morale and limiting social interaction. Imagine looking forward to a rare opportunity to see friends or trade goods, only for a sudden storm to keep you trapped in your isolated home for days or weeks, intensifying the pervasive loneliness. The psychological toll of living in such intimate, often brutal connection with the weather was immense. It fostered a deep sense of humility towards nature, but also a pervasive anxiety and a feeling that humans were never truly in control. Every sunny day was a blessing, every storm a test. This wasn't just about survival, it was about living with a constant, unspoken awareness that the natural world held ultimate power over your existence, leading to a pervasive fatalism for some, and a relentless, exhausting battle for others. Their adaptive strategies were ingenious but often came at a high cost. Building homes with thick walls to regulate temperature, developing diverse agricultural practices to spread risk, preserving food through salting, smoking, and drying, and creating warm, layered clothing from natural materials were all responses to the weather's demands. But these methods required immense labor, constant vigilance, and often meant enduring discomfort. The misery wasn't just the occasional extreme event, it was the constant, pervasive struggle to simply live within the dictates of an unpredictable and powerful natural world. Every morning was a new negotiation with the elements. Every evening a reflection on whether the day's efforts had been enough to secure survival. This created a legacy of resilience, but also a deep-seated respect for the elements that defined every waking moment. The academic debate about the precise level of human agency versus environmental determinism in shaping historical societies often grapples with how much the weather truly dictated daily life versus how much humans adapted to it. Some historians argue that while weather certainly presented significant challenges, human societies consistently demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptability. Developing sophisticated technologies like irrigation systems or seasonal dwellings and social structures like communal labor or food sharing that allowed them to mitigate many of the weather's worst effects and even thrive in diverse climates. Suggesting that while difficult, humans were not entirely passive victims of the elements, but active shapers of their own survival. They contend that human ingenuity often overcame misery. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the overwhelming and inescapable nature of prolonged or extreme weather events, arguing that despite human efforts, major droughts, floods, or volcanic winters. Remember, Chapter 7 often acted as ultimate bottlenecks, imposing severe limitations on population growth, technological development, and social organization, fundamentally shaping migration patterns, resource allocation, and even cultural beliefs, highlighting that for vast stretches of human history, the impact of weather was often less about adaptation and more about enduring unavoidable misery and surrendering to nature's ultimate power. They suggest that the daily grind was often relentless and inescapable. It's a debate that makes you ponder the profound connection between humanity and the natural world, and how utterly dependent we once were on the shifting winds, the falling rain, and the warming sun. As the quiet hum of the elements and the distant echoes of daily struggles from our journey slowly fade, and the gentle rhythm of your room returns, you are left with a stark understanding of why weather's impact on daily life was often a truly agonizing and miserable experience. These weren't just background conditions. They were fundamental challenges that brought real pain, profound anxiety, and constant reminders of human fragility in the face of nature's relentless power. Their very existence, however simple one, was always shadowed by the very real possibility of starvation, sickness, or immediate danger dictated by the sky. Take a moment to appreciate the comforting, invisible shield of climate control. Grocery stores filled year-round, and easy travel a reassurance that was a distant, dangerous dream for those who braved the awful side of elemental daily life. As the quiet hum of the elements and the distant echoes of daily struggles from our last chapter mercifully fade, allowing the gentle rhythm of your room to truly settle, our deep dive into how people dealt with awful weather before technology and more reaches its peaceful conclusion. This final chapter brings us to modern resilience and echoes, a reflection on how these historical struggles, though centuries removed from our meticulously regulated and technologically advanced societies, continue to resonate, often subtly, within our contemporary lives, offering profound insights into the enduring human experience. Imagine, if you will, looking around your own room right now. You're likely surrounded by an array of comforts and conveniences, advanced medical care at your fingertips, clothes made from safe materials, clean water from the tap, readily available food that won't poison you, and a general expectation of safety and dignity. Yet, despite all our advancements, a deep, ancient part of our human experience still grapples with anxieties that are strikingly similar to those that made our ancestors' lives so dreadful. You might scroll through social media on your phone, perhaps seeing a news report about a factory mishap, or a health scare. Or perhaps you feel a nagging concern about the well-being of someone you know struggling with their mental health. That, my friend, is the echo. First, let's consider the enduring anxiety of predictability. While we have sophisticated weather forecasts that can predict hurricanes days in advance and alert us to impending blizzards, the underlying anxiety about weather's power remains. Think about the collective dread when a major storm system is bearing down on the coast, or the rapid spread of fear during a sudden tornado warning across the plain states. Even with technology, the primal fear of nature's raw force. Remember Chapter 1's Ancient Storm Survival, and Chapter 6's Wind the Unseen Fury still surfaces, reminding us that control is always, to some extent, an illusion. We've replaced the gut feeling and folklore with algorithms, but the human reaction to impending doom is remarkably similar. The most disturbing echo of past weather misery is the fragility of our interconnected systems. Our modern world relies on complex supply chains, stable power grids, and extensive communication networks. A severe weather event, a major ice storm in Texas, a prolonged heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, or a hurricane hitting a major port can still cripple these systems, leading to power outages, food shortages, and disrupted travel. Eerily reminiscent of the isolation and scarcity our ancestors faced during brutal winters, Chapter 2, or devastating floods, Chapter 4. Imagine your grocery store shelves suddenly bare because a cold snap thousands of miles away froze critical infrastructure. It's like discovering that your ultra-modern fortress has a tiny, yet critical medieval-era flaw, a common historical fact. The COVID-19 pandemic, while not a weather event, highlighted the extreme fragility of global supply chains and the profound impact of isolation on human society, echoing the widespread famine. Chapter 5's Drought the Silent Killer and Community Isolation. Chapter 4's Floods that severe weather could cause in pre-technological times. The rush for essential goods, the fear of scarcity, and the sudden cessation of normal life were universal experiences, reminding us that even in the 21st century, our modern comforts can be swiftly stripped away, leaving us vulnerable in ways we often forget. Imagine a world-changing event disrupting your daily coffee supply. One particularly grim, lesser-known echo from the past involves the psychological impact of climate anxiety on modern generations. Unlike our ancestors who lived with immediate localized weather threats, many people today, especially younger generations, grapple with a pervasive, long-term dread about global climate change. This isn't the sudden terror of a storm, but a slow, gnawing worry about the future of the planet, rising sea levels, and increasingly extreme weather events. This echoes the Year Without a Summer, remember Chapter 7's volcanic ash and atmospheric haze, and its global, incomprehensible impact, where an unseen force created widespread, prolonged misery. Imagine feeling a low hum of anxiety about the world's climate, a burden that subtly shapes your life choices and pervades your thoughts. Even on a sunny day, it's like living under a perpetually red sky in the morning scenario, where the warning is always there. But the storm is a generational event. The enduring human desire for control over nature is another powerful echo. From ancient rain dances to modern geoengineering proposals, humanity has always sought to bend the weather to its will, while we now use cloud seeding or sophisticated dam systems. The fundamental impulse to manage or fix the weather stems from centuries of suffering at its mercy. This ambition, though often beneficial, also carries risks, reminding us of the unintended consequences our ancestors faced with their well-intentioned, but often harmful, cures for bad weather. It's like our ancestors' desperate prayers, but with a scientific grant application attached. Consider also the resilience and ingenuity of communities in the face of disaster. When a modern hurricane strikes a coastal town or a wildfire devastates a community in California, you often see remarkable acts of neighbor helping neighbor, communal rebuilding efforts, and an almost innate human drive to recover and adapt. This directly echoes the survival strategies of ancient peoples. Remember Chapter 1's ancient storm survival and Chapter 9's weather's impact on daily life, who, despite their limited tools, continuously found ways to rebuild and carry on. The human spirit, when confronted with overwhelming natural forces, seems to possess a timeless capacity for endurance and cooperation. The economic disparities in weather vulnerability also remain a significant echo. Just as wealthier ancient communities might have had better food stores or more robust homes, modern impoverished communities, both domestically and globally, often bear the brunt of extreme weather. They have fewer resources for evacuation, less resilient infrastructure, and slower recovery times. This underscores that while technology has advanced, the fundamental injustice of some populations being more vulnerable to the elements persists, showing how economic status can amplify the misery, just as it did in the past. The misery isn't just the memory of past hardships, it's the realization that some aspects of our vulnerability to weather are timeless. Despite our comfort, we are still biological beings on a planet with powerful, unpredictable forces. Our bodies still feel the heat, the cold, the wind, and the rain. Our food still depends on rain and sun. Our sense of security can still be shattered by a sudden, violent storm. This humility, this deep-seated understanding that nature holds ultimate sway, is perhaps the most profound lesson learned from our ancestors' struggles. The academic debate about the role of technology in mitigating versus simply displacing weather-related misery often grapples with whether our advancements truly solve the fundamental problem or just shift its location or nature. Some historians and environmental scientists argue that while technology has undoubtedly saved countless lives and greatly reduced immediate suffering from individual weather events in developed nations, it has also created new vulnerabilities, e.g., dependence on fragile infrastructure, exacerbated climate change, and often shifted the burden of weather-related misery onto less developed nations or future generations, suggesting that our resilience is often a complex, unevenly distributed phenomenon, and that our relationship with weather is far from truly mastered. They contend that our modern comforts come with hidden costs and new forms of misery. Conversely, other scholars emphasize the unprecedented improvements in human well-being, life expectancy, and global interconnectedness directly attributable to our mastery of weather through technology from irrigation and climate control to advanced agriculture and disaster warning systems, arguing that while challenges remain, our ability to predict, mitigate, and recover from extreme weather is fundamentally superior to any prior era, and that for the vast majority of people, modern life has dramatically reduced the daily, existential misery inflicted by the elements. They suggest that while not perfect, our technological advancements represent a profound triumph over ancient vulnerabilities. It's a debate that makes you ponder the true meaning of progress, and whether we have truly escaped the awful weather of the past, or merely reconfigured its enduring challenges. As the quiet hum of your modern world and the distant echoes of humanity's long struggle with the elements from our journey finally embrace you, you are left with a profound understanding. The awful weather of the past wasn't just a quaint historical curiosity. It was a fundamental force that shaped every aspect of human life, pushing our ancestors to the brink, forging their resilience, and leaving a legacy that still whispers in our contemporary anxieties. But tonight, there are no unpredictable droughts threatening your food, no terrifying blizzards trapping you in isolation, no sudden floods sweeping away your home, and no mysterious hazes darkening your sky. The harsh realities of the past are now illuminated by scientific understanding and confined to the fascinating, yet sometimes grim, realm of history. So, let the echoes of these historical miseries fade now. Let the discomfort of past pain and the anxieties of forgotten perils Dissolve into the quiet hum of your night. Your body grows heavy, your mind serene. Just rest now, and let the quietness of your peaceful space guide you into a deep, restorative sleep.